Hi, in this video I'm going to talk with you about OT's core business, which is occupation and activity analysis. The required reading for this week is a chapter in our book written by Mackenzie and O'Toole and James. It's a really good introduction, really good solid introduction to activity, task and occupational analysis. And the extended reading that I have listed here, which is in the previous version of Willard and Spackman, is an excellent resource for furthering your understanding of this actually quite complex set of concepts. So the learning objectives for this video, and which I want you to bring to class, is I want to talk about the difference between occupation and activity. I want you to understand the difference between occupational profile, performance and analysis, or just start to understand. We're going to talk about the taxonomic code of occupational performance and also introduce occupational therapy's process as described by the American Occupational Therapy Association. And I'll finish with a neat diagram that I really like that depicts the enabling-disabling process. Okay, so what's the difference between occupation and activity? Let's firstly start with why we're so focused on occupation and not activity. In the extension reading, they actually talk about this a bit, and that occupation is where our profession was founded, as you know. And then during a different phase, after a certain period of time, we became more aligned with sort of medical models and looked at the areas of activity and function in more detail, and we lost the focus on occupation. And then in the 90s and since, we have refocused, well actually it started in the 70s, but since the 90s we've definitely been more focused back on occupation. And so we use occupation as both a treatment and a goal, which we call means and ends. The reason we do this is because using occupations as approach leads to all of these outcomes. So achieving a sense of autonomy, mastery and relatedness, and I've used those words very specifically because those words come from self-determination theory by DC and Ryan, and I think it's a really good idea. I mean, you will hear about this more in your degree, but it's a fantastic theory for you to look into if you're excited to extend your learning. Occupations encourage you to go further. Using occupations as part of therapy transfers to other goals. Using occupations challenges you to use multiple skills and body systems. And it also gives immediate feedback to the client on their performance. So how do occupations differ from activities? Well, in the AOTA framework, domain and process, the term occupation denotes life engagements that are constructed of multiple activities. According to Carlson and Clark, occupations have a start and end point, they're intentional, they have meaning, and they're labelled by our culture. And as you know, in other spaces, occupation simply means your work or your job. That's not what we mean when we say occupation. In our textbook, Mackenzie, O'Toole and James described occupations around the nature of the occupation itself, such as the skills and values required circumstances and occupational structures such as the expectation of the occupation. And they also wrote that engaging in occupation provides meaning and purpose for the person, making the occupation personal and unique. You can see some similarities with other definition there. Activities can be defined as actions designed and selected to support the development of performance skills and performance patterns to enhance occupational engagement. Sometimes occupational therapy practitioners use the words occupation and activity interchangeably to describe participation in daily life pursuits. But some scholars have proposed that the two terms are different, and 4 of them are listed there. in our program here at University of the Sunshine Coast, our consensus is that activities occur in the context of an occupation. For example, shaving can occur in the context of being a worker or in the context of self-care activities or self-care occupations. See, I even slip up myself. The best way to understand is, and this came from the extension reading, is it's like a lens. So if you think about a camera and you're looking big picture, we're looking at occupations. And then as we come down closer, we can see the activities inside each occupation. Okay, so shaving can be part of self-care occupations, as can teeth brushing and getting dressed, and they're all different activities. When we get to the taxonomic code of occupation, a few more slides, I can bring this example up and take it further. There are individual components that need to be considered, and these consist of the intrinsic aspects of the individual. These are interwoven within the contextual elements. And time of life, age, abilities, personality, motivation, gender, expected roles, and individual values and beliefs exist within a dynamic personal system. I'm going to talk about that word roles there. In the extension reading, I noticed that they actually addressed that topic directly, and the authors said that they prefer not to use the word roles because of the unconscious bias that can occur with using the word role. For example, when you use the word mother, immediately with it, because of your life experience and your culture, you conjure up immediately visions and thoughts of what mother means. However, if you, and that's because of roles. So if you said the role of mother, and then you could almost list the things that you think mothers do. If you are speaking with a client who says an important occupation of mine or an important thing to me is being a mum, then you can have a conversation about the activities that are inside that, and that mum might have a completely different set of activities that you would imagine from your experience. So what they were cautioning us about was to be open to other people's interpretations by perhaps not using the word role. So I'm going to need reminding about that one because I use it all the time. The final point here is that individual components determine choices, expectations, capacities, and decisions when undertaking occupations. So this, a very small definition came from the extension reading, and I've given you the page reference so you can find it. To look at the difference between occupational analysis and activity analysis, occupational analysis refers to systematically analysing what and how a person or groups of people actually do an activity, whereas activity analysis refers to considering a more general idea of how things are usually done. So, teeth brushing, for example, you might, do an activity analysis using a basic toothbrush, toothpaste, some water at a basin, and a mirror in front of the person, because that's probably what we imagine that activity to need. But in the context of self-care occupations, in fact, it could be an electric toothbrush while sitting in a wheelchair using, I don't know what paste. You know what I'm saying? It just means that we've got to think about different ways. And so occupational analysis looks at the whole picture of the person and their context and also their goals. A couple of further definitions which I pulled in from the textbook are here. Occupational analysis, the process of exploring the transactional relationship between the characteristics of an occupation, the personal meanings attributed to the occupation by individuals, groups and communities, and the contribution of environmental factors to the performance of an occupation. I like that one, it's pretty cool. That's from the text. Activity analysis, examination of demands of an activity that stipulates required skills and component tasks for successful completion of the activity. I did a lot of activity analysis when I worked in rehab, for example, occupational rehab, and getting people back to work, especially if they weren't in the role. We had to do an activity analysis of what the job would demand of them. And task analysis is exploration of the sets of actions required to complete particular task or tasks within an activity, within an occupation. Okay, so the context, I really like the fact that this is actually a blend of, from our book, but also the American Occupational Therapy Association's from the Domain and Process document. So the contexts are cultural context, so the setting for and expectations of the occupation; spiritual, so the values and beliefs that motivate towards the person towards that occupation; political and institutional, so rules and management of environments where occupations take place; social context, the influence of family, friends, colleagues, pets, neighbours, and so on the performance of occupations; technological context, so the demands of modern day of occupations includes technology, and don't overlook that one these days; socioeconomic, the availability of resources and access, so that really impacts people's ability to participate in the occupations they need and want to do; and physical context, the physically built and the natural and the temporal environments. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is the occupational profile, performance and analysis. So an occupational profile is a summary of a client's occupational history and experiences, their patterns of daily living, interests, values and needs. Developing the occupational profile provides the occupational therapy practitioner with an understanding of the client's perspective and background. It sets the scene. Analysis of occupational performance requires an understanding of the complex and dynamic interaction among client factors, performance skills, performance patterns and contexts and environments, along with the activity demands of the occupation being performed. So that is quite complex, and that's something that you will learn to do over the coming years as an OT student. Occupation/activity analysis. Analysis of the typical demands of an activity, the range of skills involved in its performance, and the various cultural meanings that might be ascribed to it. So that one is from Crepeau et al., and that was in 2003. So you can see that you can find many, many different definitions. So why is occupational analysis important? Occupations are the fundamental focus of occupational therapy. Engagement in occupations is based on individual values, preferences and meaning. So analysis of occupations that are important to a person is needed at each stage of the occupational therapy process. So for example, articulating the occupational performance issue and assessing the aspects of the occupation and setting goals and designing interventions are critical stages in the whole process. Looking at occupational analysis through the lens of the PEO model. When we undertake an overall occupational performance analysis, we're looking at performance of an occupation, usually by an individual within a specific context. So that's the overlap of all three areas. During an occupational performance analysis, we often detect areas that need to be further assessed because it's unclear which one is specifically impacting the performance. So that means you might have to do an evaluation in the area of P, the person. Maybe it's a cognitive concern, maybe it's a physical concern, or it could be affective, their emotions. So, and again, it could be the actual environment impacting them. So that's why we always seem to have this in the back of our mind, the P, the E, the O. What are they doing? Where are they doing it? Who are they doing it with? How well are they doing it? I really liked this phrase. It was from the extension reading and the citations there. I've actually paraphrased it, but occupational orchestration is analysing how individuals enact their occupations to meet their own needs within the environments in which these occupations occur and across time. Now, this literally means how people put together all the things they need to and want to do in their life. So maybe it's across a day, across a week, across a month, across a year. So as an OT, this is really of interest to you, how a person can occupationally orchestrate. The next thing I want to talk about is the Taxonomic Code of Occupational Performance, which was developed by the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists. And this is the one that I want you to learn for this course. Okay, so here's the diagram itself from their textbook. And you can see that on the left-hand side it talks about level of complexity. And then it talks about the definition, which is great. And they've got an example. So at the highest level, so you don't remember, camera lens out, occupation is the highest level. So this is an activity or set of activities that are performed with some consistency and regularity that brings structure and is given value and meaning by individuals and a culture. They've given the example here of accountancy, okay? So it's an interesting one to choose because some people said, yeah, but that's a job. And some people got confused, but it doesn't matter. Whatever they chose, somebody would say, but wait a minute. So anyway, occupation is the top level. So we're thinking about an accountant. So someone's performing their role as an accountant. And nested inside that is the activity. So a set of tasks with a specific endpoint or outcome that is greater than that of any constituent task. So the example they've given is financial report writing. So the person's writing a financial report and there's many tasks involved in that activity. And not being accountant, I'm not going to list them off, but you can imagine. The task here is defined as a set of actions having an endpoint or a specific outcome. So perhaps the example here is printing the report, but there would have been other steps involved and tasks involved leading to the printing of the report. So that's why you can see how the activity is sets of tasks. Then below task is action. This is a set of voluntary movements or mental processes, it's usually and mental processes, that form a recognisable and purposeful pattern, such as grasping, holding, pulling, pushing, turning, kneeling, etc. So an example that they've given here is folding, remembering the meaning of numbers, would be calculating, things like that. And below that is voluntary movement or mental processes. And this is right down to that very base level that you almost can't see. So simple voluntary muscle or mental activations such as extension, flexion, adduction and abduction, and rotation, supination, pronation, blinking, memory, attention. This is also where interpersonal communication and those sorts of, that's that sort of level as well. So the person in this example, the accountant doing all these things, was doing things like maybe they flexed forward to pick something up. Maybe they were extending their fingers and typing. See how all of these things help you understand why, as an occupational therapist, you need to understand body structure and function very well. And that's why you learn anatomy, physiology, biosciences, and you do psychology courses, because you're looking at that very, the minutiae of the person being able to do activities and and the voluntary movement or mental processes is an essential thing to be able to observe and assess. So here's the occupational therapy process as described by the American Occupational Therapy Association, and it's a bit different to the one we looked at that was by the Canadian Practice Process Framework, CPPF, which was in a different video. So this process, the actual process here, it's depicting the fact that you're always operating inside a context and environment, which has come through all of this slides so far in this presentation, and that there's multitude of things that you do, and as much as they do kind of fall into a natural sequence of, similar to enter, initiate, set stage, and then evaluate, they talk about doing the occupational therapy profile, the occupational profile first, which is part of evaluation, and then to do other investigations before you do interventions, and because you've got to target the outcomes and evaluate the outcomes as you go. So there's a continual cycle of analysing occupational performance that doesn't just sort of start on day one and finish there. It's continued right throughout the time that you work with the client. And you select different outcome measures and apply different interventions along the way, and you look at different outcome measures as you go to know whether or not you're achieving the goals that the client has set. So it's a continual moving transactive process. So the process is probably, I don't know whether it's easier for you to see this, but the domain and process, so working from the outside again, context and environment, and that our goal is our domain. So what we want to achieve with the client is to achieve health, well-being and participation in life through engagement in occupation. And this, the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework 3rd edition is based on the ICF, which was developed by the World Health Organization. And this helps us establish our domain and the areas that occupational therapy take place. So this helps us to understand also which is our domain and which is the domain of other healthcare practitioners and where we overlap, which we do all the time. So you can see here that they've got the evaluation intervention process which target outcomes, and they're in the circle around the outside. And then we've got inside, we've got all of the different areas of occupation which are listed. So we've got social participation, education, play, work, activities of daily living, leisure, instrumental activities of daily living, rest and sleep. And they're all swirling around, like they're all our occupations. And inside the middle is the client factors, the performance patterns, and the performance skills. And those three components are so important in occupational analysis. The next diagram I'm going to show you is the enabling disabling process. This is a very interesting diagram that just simply describes the occupational therapy process. And it's getting a little bit old now, but I still like it, and I think it's fantastic for the early years of your degree, and also later on for even explaining to others what you do as an occupational therapist. So the first part of the picture is a person who clearly doesn't need occupational therapy because they fit inside the box, i.e. they fit inside their environment and they can do the occupations that are meaningful to them. However, say their needs change, they then don't fit the box. When they don't fit the box, they need OT. and maybe some other people. But of course, OT is most important. So the two things that are listed here that we would do is look at the environment. So we might look at changing the environment, and you know now that there are so many aspects to the environment, not just the built. It could be social, it could be institutional, it could be the built environment. So it's not just a ramp, it could be access to finances, things like that. And the other one down below is the word functional restoration, but that could be that you change or help build up the person's capacity to do their occupation. So maybe build their strength or build their cognitive capacity, or perhaps it's actually the task itself that you change, and that would fit in there. So I think what this diagram shows me is that we as occupational therapists try very hard to fit the task to the human first, and then the human to the task second. So that's the end of part A. Please go to part B next so that you can see the next section, which is talking a little bit more about the practice process framework.